The university's basement smelled of dust, ink, and decades-old neglect. To most, it was nothing more than a storage pit for forgotten donations. Rooms lined with unmarked crates, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent tubes. But to Marisol Vega, it was sanctuary. She moved in silence between the stacks, her fingertips grazing the brittle edges of manuscripts and the cold metal clasps of ancient chests. She'd long ago learned that being overlooked was an advantage. People left you alone, and history revealed itself only to the patient. On that rain-slick Tuesday, she noticed a crate in the farthest corner. It had no inventory tag, just a dull brass lock hanging loose as though it had been opened decades ago and never claimed. The wood was warped, the lid bowed slightly. Most archivists would log it for disposal. Marisol pulled it forward, dust rising in a cloud around her face. Inside, layers of burlap hid something dense, wrapped in animal hide. She peeled the coverings back to reveal a flat bundle, its leather cover darkened with age, the texture stiff and almost brittle. A faint odor of smoke clung to it, as if it had been rescued from a fire long ago. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The symbols etched into the cover weren't the common glyphs she had catalogued in the Mayan collections upstairs. These were sharper, more angular, almost rushed, as if the scribe had written under duress. Marisol had spent most of her career buried in other people's discoveries. She was known only to a handful of faculty, and even then, her name was usually followed by, "Oh, the quiet one downstairs." It never bothered her, until she felt the weight of this codex in her hands. It was as if the book had been waiting for her, its silent voice urging her to open it. She carried it to her desk, aware of the faint tremor in her hands. The binding cracked faintly as she opened the first page, revealing a cascade of unfamiliar glyphs. The ink had faded into a rich brown, but the strokes were still deliberate and bold. She recognized certain calendar markers, Tzolk'in cycles and Khatun counts, but the order was strange. They didn't follow the standard chronological flow. Instead, they looped and inverted, as if describing events not yet completed. The page ended with a jagged red mark, stark against the parchment, and a symbol she'd never seen before, half sun, half tear. Her mind ticked through references, scanning the mental index she had built over decades. Nothing matched. The air in the basement felt heavier, the rain above beating harder against the skylights. She reached for her notebook and began sketching, knowing instinctively that this would consume her nights for weeks to come. As she worked, her mind kept drifting to the crate's absence from the university's catalogue. Someone had sent this here without record. Someone had hidden it. She traced the sharp curves of the half-sun, half-tear again, feeling a strange unease. These weren't the musings of a priest or the glorifications of a king. These glyphs read like a warning, urgent, compressed into as few words as possible, meant for someone in the future. Her tea had gone cold by the time she finally closed the codex. She locked it in the cabinet beneath her desk, but the red-marked page burned in her memory. For the first time in years, Marisol left the basement with a racing heart. Her thoughts tangled between curiosity and dread. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Marisol Vega's life. Above, the rain kept falling. But in the quiet, sealed air of the basement, an ancient voice had begun to speak again, and Marisol had just agreed to listen. By morning, the rain had given way to a pale, hesitant light filtering through the dusty windows of the archive. Marisol arrived earlier than usual, clutching a thermos of coffee and a gnawing sense of anticipation. She had dreamed of glyphs all night, looping symbols, rearranging themselves into patterns she almost understood before waking with a start. The Codex sat where she had left it, locked in the cabinet beneath her desk. She turned the key, careful not to let the lock's click echo too loudly. In the world above, students and faculty shuffled through their routines. Down here, she was alone with something that had not been touched in perhaps centuries. Laying the Codex open on the felt-lined desk, she brushed a soft cloth over the page with the red marked symbol. Her eyes followed the strange sequence again. Cartoon cycles out of order, astronomical events paired with human disasters, glyphs for fire and flood beside symbols of cornfields and stone walls. The half-sun, half-tear icon repeated at irregular intervals, always accompanied by the same sequence of 4 glyphs: death, eclipse, storm, silence. She retrieved her magnifying glass, leaning in until her breath fogged the lens. In the margin of the 3rd page, so faint it was nearly invisible, she saw smaller script, Mayan glyphs written in a scribe's cursive hand. It was a note, perhaps an annotation, by the original writer. She copied the characters into her notebook, then cross-referenced them with the worn dictionary on her shelf. The translation came slowly, word by word, until the message took shape. When the shadow drinks the sun, the walls will break and the children will vanish. The words sat heavy in her mind, unsettling in their precision. She felt the first flicker of fear, an irrational sense that this was not merely history recorded, but a prophecy still waiting to be fulfilled. Marisol's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She quickly closed the Codex and draped a cloth over it. It was Professor Aldridge, head of Mesoamerican Studies, his silver hair immaculate as always. "Vega," he said, scanning the cluttered desk with mild disapproval. "Cataloguing the lower storage donations?" "Yes," she replied evenly. "A few unmarked items came through." "Be thorough, but don't waste time on scraps. The real material is upstairs." His gaze lingered on the cloth-draped shape of the Codex, but he didn't ask. He never asked. Aldridge had built his career on grand expeditions, not dusty basement finds. To him, archivists were background figures, hands to sort the relics until something worthy appeared for the display cases. As his footsteps faded, Marisol exhaled slowly. She reopened the Codex and continued turning the brittle pages. The illustrations grew more vivid, scenes of walled cities, jaguar warriors in mid-battle, temples wreathed in fire. Then, on the 7th page, her heart jolted. A detailed map spread across the parchment, its orientation tilted, rivers and coastlines marked with symbols. She recognized the cartography style of the post-classic Mayan period, but one landmark seized her attention. A walled city, its outline perfectly matching an archaeological site she had visited as a graduate student. Uxmal. Her pen trembled as she circled the city's glyph. Next to it, the half-sun, half-tear symbol appeared again, drawn larger than anywhere else in the Codex. The translation was clear now. This wasn't a random record. It was a timeline of disasters culminating in the collapse of Uxmal. The prophecy's final lines were chilling. "The fall will come when the shadow swallows the sun in the year of the serpent." Marisol leaned back, pulse racing. She opened the almanac on her desk, flipping to the modern astronomical charts. The next solar eclipse visible in the Yucatan was less than 8 months away, and it fell in the Mayan year of the serpent. The basement, suddenly felt colder. For the first time in years, Marisol wished she wasn't alone down here. The coffee in her thermos had long gone lukewarm, but Marisol barely noticed. Her desk was a chaos of open books, scattered notes and highlighters, her quiet, meticulous order giving way to frantic connections drawn in ink and pencil. The Codex lay at the center of it all, its fragile pages pinned gently under glass weights to prevent them from curling. She had spent the last 2 days cross-referencing every glyph in the sequence. The patterns were undeniable now. This was no haphazard recording of historical events. It was a deliberate chronological prophecy, each disaster leading to the next with eerie precision. She traced the glyph for eclipse with the tip of her pen, noting how often it appeared just before a symbol for walls broken or fields burning. Her mind kept circling back to the annotations in the margins, tiny, hurried notes that hinted at a deeper layer to the prophecy. One, translated after hours of comparison, read, "Do not speak it aloud. The city will hasten its fate." It made no sense from a modern perspective, yet a part of her, the part that had learned to respect the quiet whispers of history, felt a twinge of unease every time her eyes landed on it. By the third night, she'd stopped going home. She slept in the archive's narrow reading room, curling up in the old leather armchair under the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. The Codex seemed to draw her deeper each time she opened it, its strange energy pressing against her thoughts. And then it happened, her first real breakthrough. Under magnification, she noticed that the glyph sequences for each catastrophe were accompanied by faint, almost invisible dots, like a code within the code. Her pulse quickened as she counted them, realizing they matched the intervals of the Tzolk'in, the sacred Mayan calendar. By cross-referencing these with modern astronomical predictions, she was able to map the prophecy's timeline with startling accuracy. The climax, the fall of the walled city, would coincide perfectly with the eclipse she had already calculated. It was no longer an academic guess. It was a match precise to the day. A soft knock startled her from her work. She looked up to see Thomas Ortega, one of the graduate students who occasionally helped in the archive. He was carrying a box of sorted manuscripts, but froze when he saw the spread of material on her desk. "What is all this?" he asked, stepping closer. Marisol hesitated. She had told no one, partly out of habit, partly from a fear she couldn't quite name. "It's a donation I'm cataloguing," she said, though the words tasted false. Thomas glanced at the Codex under the glass weights. "That's not in the digital registry. Where did it come from?" She offered no answer, and after a long pause, he set the box down. "Whatever you're working on, you look obsessed. Just be careful, okay? Sometimes digging too deep uncovers more than you're ready for." His tone was casual, but his eyes lingered on the red-marked symbol before he turned to leave. When he was gone, Marisol stared at the door, her mind replaying his words. She'd always believed that history revealed its secrets to those patient enough to listen. But now she wondered, was she listening to something meant to be heard, or something that had been buried for a reason? She pulled her notebook closer and began writing in the margin. "If the prophecy is true, Uxmal's fall will come in 242 days. Her hand hovered over the pen for a moment before she added, "And I may be the only one who knows." The day after Thomas's visit, Marisol arrived to find an envelope on her desk. No name, no seal, just a single sheet inside, yellowed and smelling faintly of cedar. On it, written in a precise, almost calligraphic Spanish hand, were 5 words. Some doors should stay closed. She stared at it for a long time, pulse quickening. The basement archives were locked at night, Only 3 people had keys, and 2 of them barely knew her name. Someone wanted her to stop, and that meant someone knew what she had found. Marisol's first instinct was to lock the Codex away in the climate-controlled vault. But the moment she picked it up, her curiosity crushed that impulse. She was closer than ever to fully translating the prophecy, and each page whispered a little louder, a little more insistently. That night, she returned to the red-marked page and the map of Uxmal. She traced the city's walls in the drawing, noticing details she had overlooked before. Small dots outside the gates, glyphs for fire and wind sketched along the city's northern edge. Then, in the lower corner, almost hidden by the page's frayed border, was a faint line of text written in the scribe's delicate hand. The translation chilled her. "The serpent year will not come alone. It will bring the strangers, and they will open the earth." She leaned back, closing her eyes, memories of Uxmal flooding her mind, the towering pyramid of the magician, the intricate stone mosaics, the air heavy with the scent of ceiba trees. It was a living site, still visited daily by tourists, still studied by archaeologists. But she also remembered the rumors, locals speaking of companies eyeing the land beyond the gates, plans for new construction dangerously close to the ruins. Her thoughts were interrupted by the clatter of a dropped binder. She looked up to see Professor Aldridge at the far table, flipping through a collection of colonial manuscripts. His gaze drifted to her desk. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to the Codex. "A donation," she said, her voice steady. "From where?" "Not sure yet. No record." Aldridge approached, his sharp eyes scanning the glyphs. "You're working on Mayan script? I thought you specialized in colonial Spanish." "I've studied both," she replied carefully. He tapped the glass weight over the page. "Well, don't get too deep into myths. Grants go to publishable work, Vega, not ghost stories. Stick to verifiable history." When he left, the silence pressed heavier than before. Marisol stared at the Codex, a knot tightening in her stomach. She didn't need Aldridge's approval, but she did need access to records that only he could authorize. And if he suspected she was chasing something unverifiable, he could cut her off entirely. Pushing the thought aside, she returned to her translation work. The prophecy's sequence was now almost complete, and the footnotes left little room for doubt. The eclipse in the serpent year, the breaking of the city's walls, the disappearance of its children, and the arrival of strangers who would open the earth. That last phrase gnawed at her. Open the earth could mean excavation, but also destruction. Before she locked the Codex away for the night, she penciled one final note in her journal. If this is true, we have less than 8 months to stop it. The morning began with a phone call that shattered Marisol's fragile sense of control. "Señorita Vega?" The voice on the other end was accented, clipped. "This is Dr. Emilio Torres from the Yucatan Preservation Council. We received a curious request from your department. Your name attached." Marisol's pulse spiked. "I haven't submitted any requests." There was a pause. "Then you may wish to know, someone has asked for excavation permits along Uxmal's northern wall. Construction of a private resort." Her pen snapped in her hand. "Who filed it?" "I cannot say over the phone," Torres replied. "But if you care about the site, I suggest you come in person." She hung up, the receiver still warm in her palm, and sat in silence. "Strangers will open the earth." The line from the prophecy echoed in her mind until her skin prickled. By afternoon, she had packed the Codex in a padded leather satchel, wrapped in silk and sealed with archival tape. It felt like carrying a live coal. She didn't trust it in anyone else's hands. Not the vault, not Aldridge, not the university. Her plan was simple. Fly to Merida, meet Torres, and see the permits herself. But simple plans rarely survived contact with reality. At the airport, a man in a grey suit with reflective sunglasses lingered too long at the check-in counter behind her. On the plane, she spotted him again. Same posture, same blank expression, as if waiting for her to acknowledge him. She didn't. Instead, she kept one hand on the satchel the entire flight. In Merida, Torres met her at a small cafe near the preservation office. He was shorter than she expected, with sun-darkened skin and a deliberate way of speaking. "You came quickly. That means you understand the danger." "Show me the permit," she said. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were crisp government forms, maps, and approval stamps. The applicant's name made her chest tighten. Aldridge International Cultural Expeditions. The official reason: preliminary excavation and soil reinforcement for heritage-compatible tourist facilities. Marisol's throat went dry. He's not just building, he's digging, right where the prophecy warned. Torres lowered his voice. "If this is more than coincidence, we may not have long. The equipment arrives in 6 weeks. Her mind whirled. She could confront Aldridge. She could go to the press. But with no verified translation, she'd be dismissed as a superstitious archivist spinning tales. She needed proof. Something undeniable. That night, she pored over the Codex in her hotel room. One page caught her eye again. The eclipse glyph paired with a jaguar paw drawn beside the city's gate. The jaguar symbol often marked warriors, but here it was flanked by the glyph for messenger. She whispered the translation aloud, breaking her own vow not to. "The messenger will come under the black sun." A sound at the window made her flinch. The man in the grey suit stood across the street under a flickering street lamp, motionless, his gaze fixed on her room. Marisol closed the curtains, her heart pounding. The Codex's words throbbed in her head. She wasn't just racing against time now. Someone else was watching, and they already knew how far she'd come. The jungle was louder than Marisol remembered. Cicadas screamed from the canopy, their chorus underscored by the low rumble of distant thunder. She stood at the edge of Uxmal's outer walls, her satchel pressed to her side, scanning the limestone for the markings she had memorized from the Codex. Torres had arranged the trip quietly, slipping her past the usual tourist gates with the help of a local guard who owed him a favor. "You have 2 hours before the official tour reaches this section," he'd warned. "After that, we'll have eyes on us." The path wound through undergrowth that clung to her legs and ankles. Every few steps, she caught glimpses of the northern wall, its stonework weathered but still proud, each block a testament to centuries of survival. But here and there, the earth had shifted, leaving jagged cracks wide enough for snakes to vanish into. Marisol knelt at one of the fissures, brushing away soil with her fingers. And there it was, the jaguar paw glyph, carved low on the wall, nearly hidden by moss. The messenger. She traced its outline, a tremor in her fingertips. Above, the clouds darkened. A sheet of wind swept through the trees, carrying with it the smell of rain and something acrid, diesel fumes. She froze, listening. The distant chug of engines grew louder. Torres appeared from around the bend, his face grim. "They've arrived early," he said. "Construction crew. Aldridge himself is here." Her chest tightened. "How?" "I don't know. But they're bringing drilling rigs." They moved quickly, circling to the main clearing. Through a break in the foliage, Marisol saw them. Workers in hard hats unloading equipment, their shouts blending with the grinding roar of machinery. And there, at the center, stood Aldridge, surveying the sight like a conqueror. Torres pulled her back into the shadows. If you want to stop this, you need something they can't deny. Find whatever is under that wall before they break it apart. They doubled back, slipping along the inside perimeter until they reached a section where the wall's base had partially collapsed. Marisol set down her satchel, pulling a small trowel from within. She worked fast, scraping away dirt, exposing carved stones beneath the surface. An image began to emerge, a relief of the half-sun, half-tear symbol, larger than she had ever seen it. The stone was split down the center, as though struck by lightning. Around its edge were smaller glyphs that formed a phrase she could barely translate in the dim light. Here lies the heart of the city. Break it, and the city dies. A shout rang out behind them. Marisol whipped around to see the man in the grey suit striding toward them, 2 workers at his side. Torres stepped forward, blocking their path, his voice sharp in rapid Spanish. But the man ignored him, his eyes locked on the satchel at Marisol's feet. Rain began to fall in thick, heavy drops, the jungle's scent turning sharp and electric. Somewhere beyond the wall, an engine revved, and the sound of stone cracking echoed through the clearing. Marisol's breath caught. The prophecy wasn't waiting for the eclipse, it was already beginning. The first section of the wall collapsed with a sound like a giant exhaling. Dust billowed through the clearing, mixing with the pounding rain, until the air turned into a choking fog. Workers shouted to one another over the engine noise, their silhouettes darting back and forth like frantic insects. Marisol clutched the satchel to her chest, backing toward the jaguar glyph. Torres was beside her, his voice low and urgent. If they breach the inner chamber, whatever is in there will be gone before anyone can stop them. The man in the grey suit closed the distance between them, his shoes sinking into the mud. "Give me the Codex," he said, his tone flat, almost bored. "It belongs to us now." Marisol shook her head, rainwater dripping into her eyes. "You don't even understand what it says." "Oh," he replied, the faintest smirk on his lips. "We understand perfectly. That's why we're here." Behind him, Aldridge shouted orders in English, his voice slicing through the chaos. "Clear that rubble. If there's a vault under here, I want eyes on it in 10 minutes. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the relief of the half-sun, half-tear symbol in an eerie white glare. For an instant, the carving seemed almost alive. Water running down its cracked face like tears. Marisol felt a jolt of certainty. It wasn't just a warning, it was a marker. The heart of the city was here, directly beneath her feet. Torres glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he yanked the trowel from her bag and jammed it into the widening fissure at the base of the wall. "Help me!" he grunted. The man in the grey suit lunged forward, but Marisol blocked him with her shoulder, using every ounce of strength she had to keep him away. He was stronger, his grip closed around her arm, but Torres's digging exposed a hollow sound beneath the stones. "Marisol!" Torres shouted. "Here!" They dropped to their knees together, prying away loose rock until a dark opening appeared, narrow, but just wide enough to slide through. From within came a rush of cold air, smelling of limestone and something older, metallic. Shouts erupted behind them as 2 workers spotted the breach. Aldridge's voice rose, commanding them to stop the dig, but Marisol was already moving. She shoved the satchel through the gap, then followed headfirst into the blackness, scraping her elbows on the stone as she slid inside. The tunnel beyond was pitch dark except for the faint light of the opening. She heard Torres's grunt as he squeezed in after her, sealing them both in the humid silence of the chamber. "Now what?" he whispered. Marisol's fingers fumbled for the small flashlight in her bag. The beam cut through the dark, revealing walls covered in fresh, vivid glyphs, not faded like those in the Codex. These were sharp, clean, as if carved only decades ago. At the far end of the chamber stood a stone altar, its surface inlaid with a disk of polished obsidian. And there, in the reflection, Marisol saw it, the jaguar messenger, carved in miniature, standing beneath a blackened sun. A distant rumble vibrated through the floor. Whether it was thunder or the wall above collapsing further, she couldn't tell. But one thing was certain. The prophecy was not a relic of the past. It was unfolding now, and they were standing at its center. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The chamber felt alive, breathing with the low hum of distant thunder and the faint drip of water from somewhere in the darkness. Marisol's flashlight beam quivered as she took in the altar's details. The obsidian disk was perfectly smooth, its surface so dark it seemed to swallow light. Around its edge, glyphs spiraled inward, each one repeating the same 4 symbols she knew too well: death, eclipse, storm, silence. Torres ran a hand over the carvings on the walls. "This isn't just a warning," he murmured. "It's a record of every time the city has faced destruction. And it's still being updated." Marisol's gaze fell on the last glyph at the disk's center. Fresh scratches scored the stone as if someone, or something, had carved it in the past few months. The translation came instantly. Now. Above them, the muffled roar of engines stopped abruptly. Shouts followed, panicked this time, not commanding. Then a deep, resonant crack rolled through the stone, vibrating under her knees. Dust sifted down from the ceiling in a slow, grim rain. "They've hit a load-bearing section," Torres said, his voice low. "If the prophecy is literal, this is it, the breaking of the walls." Marisol turned to the Codex, pulling it from the satchel and flipping to the red-marked page. She placed it beside the obsidian disk, the 2 images mirroring each other in uncanny symmetry. It was the same design, but here, in the chamber, the half-sun, half-tear symbol was carved not in ink, but in stone, and beneath it a shallow recess shaped like the jaguar paw. She understood then. The messenger wasn't a person. It was a key. Without hesitating, she pressed her palm into the recess, her fingers aligning with the carved grooves. A deep, grinding sound answered, and the altar shifted, revealing a hollow space within. Inside lay a small bundle wrapped in ancient woven cloth, its colors still bright despite the centuries. She lifted it gently, unwrapping it layer by layer until a golden pendant emerged, a jaguar, mouth open, its eyes set with obsidian chips. The weight of it in her hands was immense, not in mass, but in presence. The pendant's reverse side bore an inscription: "The heart returns to the city, and the city lives." Before she could process the meaning, Torres grabbed her shoulder. "Listen!" The sound above had changed. The engines were silent, replaced by the frantic shouts of men and the crash of something massive toppling into the clearing. It wasn't just a wall collapsing, it was the jungle itself, as if the earth had decided to reclaim what was hers. Marisol shoved the pendant and the Codex back into the satchel. "We have to get out, now." They scrambled through the narrow tunnel, emerging into a world transformed. Rain poured in sheets, turning the clearing into a churning river of mud. The rigs lay abandoned, half sunk, their operators nowhere in sight. Aldridge stood near the tree line, soaked and shouting into a satellite phone, his voice lost in the storm. He saw her then, saw the satchel, and his expression shifted from fury to something closer to fear. But the moment passed. The rain thickened, and he disappeared into the chaos with the man in the grey suit close behind. Weeks later, Uxmal was officially closed for structural assessment, following the accidental collapse of its northern wall. No official report mentioned the hidden chamber. No one spoke of the pendant. Marisol returned to her basement office, the satchel locked in a vault only she could access. She would never know if the pendant had truly saved the city, or if its discovery had merely delayed an inevitable fate. But when the eclipse came months later, passing over the Yucatan in the Serpent Year, the walls of Uxmal still stood. In the quiet after the storm, she realized the prophecy had always been more than a warning. It was a choice. And this time, at least, the choice had been made in time. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.